Welcome and thank you for checking in at the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing organizational change. My name is Ali Juma, and you're listening to the Inner Game of Change podcast. Today, my guest is Hilary Scarlett, international speaker, consultant, and author on change management and neuroscience. Hilary's book, Neuroscience for Organizational Change, is an excellent and practical evidence-based guide to managing change. Based on science and research, in this episode, Hilary and I chat about the importance of understanding how our brains work when it comes to managing change and uncertainty in the workplace. I am grateful to have Hilary chatting with me today. So, Hilary, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast. Very grateful for your time to be talking to me today.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Today, Hilary, we're going to talk about your book, The Neuroscience for Organizational Change, a fantastic book full of science-based evidence, but also colored with practicality for the readers. But before we get into it, it will be great to introduce yourself to my audience.
Yeah, so a bit of background about me. My background has been in organizational change for many years. I've also had a particular interest in the people side of change. And for many years, kind of followed behind the strategy consultants as they were merging organizations or restructuring or whatever. And was always quite frustrated as to why those of us who are interested in the people side of change were always called in fairly late in the day.
Yes.
And we can perhaps discuss that later. But so having done some studies in psychology for about 12 years ago or so, I came across an article written by a psychiatrist saying we can now understand enough about the human brain to bring that to the world of work. And that really caught my interest. Perhaps if we could bring a bit more science, a bit more evidence to what we do, that could be really helpful. So that's what caught my interest and set me off in terms of studying applied neuroscience. So my work now is very much about working with organizations in the public sector, in the private sector, doing work. I guess one of the good things that's come out of the lockdown and working on Zoom and Teams is now I'm doing a lot of global work very easily because people are very used to doing sessions on Teams and Zoom. And my sessions are very much about, I guess, based on a belief that if you could understand your brain a bit better, wouldn't that be helpful for all of us? Because for all of us, our brains are our key work tool, so to speak. So I think if we can understand our brains and why they react the way they do, why we feel the way we do when we're going through change or whatever it might be at work, or indeed even outside work as well, that would be really helpful. So my work now is very much about going out into organizations and sharing that knowledge.
Fantastic. And so what prompted you to write your book and who is it for?
So the book, I was beginning to run sessions, having studied with neuroscientists originally in the States. I was beginning to run sessions using neuroscience and using the kind of evidence and research from the world of neuroscience and behavioral science. And I guess it was several things came together, really. I was running a session one day and one of the participants said, you should write the book of this. This is so helpful. You should write the book of this. And I also remember, I guess many years ago, someone saying to me, if ever you've got a book in you, you'll know. And I guess for many years, I didn't feel that way. And then suddenly, I think I did feel this is something I do want to put out there. I think this is so useful. For me, on a personal level, when I was doing my studies, I think just about every week, I thought, gosh, there's something useful here. Oh, it's not just me that feels that way. So I just felt there's something really useful here. And I think also having worked with people in organizations going through change, I just felt that having something brought more evidence for them that they could use in the organization would be incredibly helpful. Because I think some of what the neuroscience does is takes away what might be seen as just a matter of opinion and brings more science and evidence. So the book I wrote very much, I guess, for people in organizations. I guess initially in my head, I was thinking about those leaders, those managers, those change practitioners, HR people, OD people, who are trying to take organizations through change or just generally trying to improve performance in organizations. So for them, but I think also any manager, any leader, any one of us, I just think it's incredibly helpful to understand our brains better. So hence, as you say, try to put some of putting the science in there, but also trying to make it really practical for people. So what does this mean? What are some examples of what I can do? And trying to put lots of those practical examples in.
Absolutely. And look, I love your book. I read it and I use it as a toolkit as well. I use it as a reference as well. What I like about the book is actually divided into almost two parts. The first part is the theory, and the second part, you literally guide the reader through the theory and the application of that theory with examples. Was that the intention?
Yeah, very much so. It's interesting. When I first met my publisher, I actually had a very clear plan of what I wanted the book to be. And I stuck to that. I just absolutely knew. I wanted, as you say, a bit that just kind of gives the background about the brain and for people who want that, the first few chapters, but then to go into various aspects of neuroscience, say, here's a bit of the science, here's a bit of the evidence, here are the studies, but then to go into, so what does that mean? And giving practical examples. And then at the end of each chapter, also providing a summary too. And I guess that was based partly on the books that I have found incredibly useful, that I've enjoyed, that have been a mixture of the science and evidence, but also the practical, and also giving a summary at the end of each chapter. So if you want to go back to things, it's very easy to go back to look at those summaries, and there it is. So it's easy to refer back to as well. And
I find the summary section actually in your book good for those people who've got no patience and they just want to get the summary of.
Exactly. And I think you have to be pragmatic about it. People are busy people, and sometimes, no, absolutely. If there's just that summary there and that's enough, then it works for them too.
Fantastic. And we're going to put all the details about how to get a copy of your book in the podcast. Let's get into it. And so I want to tackle the concept of uncertainty in the workplace. So in a nutshell, what does neuroscience tell us about uncertainty?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting topic. And I think, I guess just to go back to some of the brain and how it responds, one of the things our brains, the key driver for our brain is survival. Your brain just wants you to make it through there. So that's its key goal. And one of the things that helps it to do that is to be able to predict what's coming up. Because if our brains can predict what's coming up, if you're out in the savannah and there's a rustle in the undergrowth and your brain can predict that might be a snake, your brain's in a better place to protect you. So our brains are often referred to as prediction machines, because what they are constantly trying to do is predict, work out what might be coming up, because they feel if they can do that, they're in a better place to protect us. So our brains crave certainty because they feel that's going to help our survival, our well-being. But I guess we all know certainty is something we can never really have, both at work and outside work. So it's one of those challenges we have in terms of our brains. But our brains, they're constantly trying to predict, so want to know what's coming up. And I think it's one of the reasons why organizational change can be very difficult for some people, in that our brains want certainty, but change takes that away. Change means I don't know what's coming up. I don't know what it might mean for me. And our brains find that difficult. Yeah.
And one of the things that I did recently, actually just last week, is an ultra marathon in the Jordanian desert.
Wow.
And so I wake up. So I wake up in the morning and I do exactly what you're talking about. I wake up looking for certainty. I've got no idea about what the course is going to be like. And I find myself almost for 15, 20 minutes exhausted thinking and looking at the track and thinking how I'm going to manage all of this. And what you're talking about here is that certainty searching machine in my brain was just looking for any information that will make it more predictable for me. Now, will I get 100% predictability? The answer is no, because sometimes a little bit of uncertainty actually is a good thing, especially for creative people. But exactly what you just talked about. The other thing is that I found that my brain was working out ways to minimize any risk, which is minimizing threat for me. So I start checking my gear and all of those things. But when I check in with myself and reflect on it, it's quite exhausting to actually go through that exercise. And the same, we wake up in the morning, the first thing we start thinking about, what things I'm gonna do during the day. Now that is also looking for predictability and certainty. Otherwise, it will be far more exhausting to go into the unknown. Mind you, sometimes going into the unknown can be a little bit more exciting than the known, but not everybody operates at that level. One of the things that I read ages ago is that the organizing principle of the brain is to maximize reward and minimize threat. Am I close to right?
Yeah, I think that's and simple. That's absolutely. I think that is what the brain is trying to do, because it goes back to this bit about survival. What do we need to survive? We need rewards. We need shelter, food, those kind of things. But also we need to minimize threats. We need to, again, if we're back out on the savannah, which is kind of where our brains think they still are, it's, to avoid that saber-toothed tiger or that tribe that's coming to attack us. So that's, I think it's a really useful concept that's as simple as that's kind of what the brain is doing. But of those two, by far the more important to the brain is to minimize the threat, because on the reward side, we can do without many rewards for quite a while, shelter, food, even water for about a week and still survive. But if the saber-toothed tiger got you, that's it. Game over. You're dead. So our brains are much more interested in threats than rewards. And also, I think you keep out. So our brains don't see the world as it is; they see it in a way that's more like to keep us alive. So they will tend to be much more interested in, sensitive to the threats. And one example I've given my sessions, because I think it kind of comes home to all of us, is that point about, each one of us could have probably been to an appraisal, and we could have been told 10 things we're really good at. Yeah. But there's just one thing over here that's really letting you down. It's a real weakness. And, how come when we walk out of that appraisal room door weeks, months, even years later, we can still remember that one negative thing, but we've forgotten the 10 nice things that we've been told. And that's just an example of the threat state being much stronger in our brains. Our brains, the nice things that are said to us or happen, our brains tend to go, that's nice, but not important in terms of survival. It's this one negative thing I need to home in on. So it's something I think we all need to stay aware of, that our brains, we don't see the world as it is. We see it in a way that's more like to keep us alive, which means we're more likely to see the threats, be aware of them, be sensitive to them. And that's one of the challenges for us, I think, particularly at work, is how do we counterbalance that? Yeah.
Let's talk about that bias for negativity a little bit, Hilary, because our works, and you mentioned the performance appraisal example, that one small negative thing can take a longer time. So positive news usually will stay in our brains for a short period of time and disappears, but the lag impact of negative events will be what I call fast and furious. Yes, it will be really sharp, and it will take a very quick time, and it will take longer time to correct it if you get to the correction stage. So I always think, is it okay to think that when we talk about change in the workplace, that by default, the majority of us will look at any upcoming change without knowing all the context around it and the details? Is it by default that we think of it as not good?
I think it depends. I think it depends. Certainly the uncertainty of change will put us into a threat state for many people. But so much depends, particularly on things like our past experience of change. That if, for example, I've been through change before, either in the current organisation or a previous organisation, and my experience of that change was that it was difficult, or it was painful, it was uncomfortable, I really didn't enjoy it, and then change is being announced again in the organisation, then there's kind of a voice in my head that will say, watch out, here comes change again, and you find it difficult and painful. If, on the other hand, I've been through change in the past and actually I found it quite exciting, maybe it gave me lots of opportunities, I learned a lot, and change is now being announced, then the voice in my head is more likely to be saying, oh, this could be interesting, this could be good for you. So past experience has a big impact on how we perceive current changes, and colour what we see, because and also the brain likes to be right. So if, when changes are announced and I think, oh, this is a mistake, we shouldn't be doing this, then I will tend to hear all the flaws and weaknesses and negatives about the change. If, on the other hand, I think it's a good idea what's just being announced, I will tend to hear all the positives, all the benefits, all those things. So, we all perceive the world differently. We all react to change differently because things like, say, past experience have a big impact on what we take in. Our current circumstances, our personality, all those things affect what we take in. So I think one of the key messages too from neuroscience is that every brain filters differently. We think we see reality. We think we see the world as it is. We don't. Our brains do a huge amount of filtering and interpreting on our behalf. And say things like past experience has a big influence on that. So one of the things I say to anybody who comes to my sessions is we've all got to stay humble. How I see the world is not how it is. It's just how my brain perceives it because of my past experience and personality and circumstances. Yeah. And other people will see the world differently. So it's that bit about stay humble and the importance of checking out what other people have understood, what they've taken in, because we do all hear different things and see the world differently. Not because we're perverse or stupid, it's because all our brains are different.
Yeah, and unfortunately, when it comes to the brain, perception is equivalent to reality. So even if it's not true, it sounds like it triggers the same threat mechanisms in the brain. What you just talked about, that we need to be aware that everybody goes through a change in a different way and looks at the world differently. How do you expect them, especially the middle management, to take those things on board when they manage change within their teams?
Yeah, and I think middle management, I just think they play such a crucial role because I think any of us who've watched an organisation, things can be put out across the organisation, but so much of what we listen to is what our manager says and the relationship we have with them. So I think they are crucial, and I think often they're the unsung heroes of change in organisations because they're the ones that really have to take the team through it. And I think also managers are the people that should know their team well enough to know how it's going to impact people differently, how different people might respond, and to take that time to understand how people are responding, and in particular to listen, because often, as we know, through change there is a lot of uncertainty. But I think one thing managers can do is say, okay, I might not be able to tell you what the future looks like in a year's time or whatever it might be, but what I can do is give you some certainty about how I will communicate with you, how I will work with you. So at least the team feels they've got some certainty around that, okay, we might not know what's coming up, but, I promise you I will sit down every Thursday morning or whatever it is with you and tell you what I know and what I don't know. So I think managers doing that as much as they can. And say listening, I think listening is a really undervalued thing too, that research does show, perhaps not surprisingly, that feeling really well listened to is very rewarding to the brain. Our brains like it. And again, that's one thing I think managers can really play that role of just being a good listener to the team member and just acknowledge what's going on. Maybe we can't change some of those things yet or whatever, but help acknowledge what's going on. And I guess going back to that certainty point, also helping the team, okay, well, here's all the things we're facing. Here's the things we can't do anything about. So let's acknowledge it, but park them and let's try and focus on the things we can control, we can influence. And that's much more helpful for the brain. As you said earlier, if there's lots of uncertainty and we're speculating, that takes a huge amount of energy. So if we can try and just focus on the things we can control where we have got certainty, I think if managers can do that, that's really helpful. And one of the things I often say to managers is if you've got people who are struggling right now because of the uncertainty that's out there, just setting people short-term goals. So if people have got goals that stretch out over weeks and months, set them some goals that they can achieve today. Because then at least by the end of the working day, they feel, tick, I've achieved something, I've done something. That's rewarding to the brain, and it puts the brain into a better place to take on a bigger challenge tomorrow. So I think there's lots of things managers can do to really help us. I do think they're crucial.
Fantastic. And I want to come back to that tick because that's related to dopamine. But so that's your sort of advice to the middle management. I do believe that managing the change in the workplace is a mutual responsibility between the leader and the follower. And I often notice that, which is normal, that when you talk about change, people in general will look for the gaps. So any gap in your communication and or your story, in the absence of the story, we will make up a story. And then unfortunately, we make up a story based on our bias. I often try to get as much info as possible and as much knowledge as possible about how to help the employees have what I call ambiguity competence.
Yeah.
So I can get to a level of insight, and only through the insight I can be slightly rational, so I can actually look at the change within its context rather than being biased, which is really not an easy thing. So what would be some of the things that you would like the employees to try to really sit in that neutral state so they can see the change as is rather than how they perceive it to be?
Yeah, and I think, I guess first come to that. I mean, I think as you say that bit about communication from leaders, from managers, and how important it is, because again, so we will fill that gap. I think the first step is just being aware of that's what our brains do. That when change is announced in an organisation, for many people, that there is a discomfort to that, because it does mean there's uncertainty coming up. It means I've got to perhaps change the way I do things. Our brains love habits, so they don't like that. So I think for me, one of the big things is just being aware of it. And again, going back to when I was doing my applied neuroscience studies, I just found incredibly helpful that sense of, so it's not just me that feels that way when something happens in the organ. I just think that's incredibly helpful. And, our brains are brilliant things, but there are certain things they find difficult. And so that whole bit about things that feel unpredictable, uncontrollable is hard for the brain. So I think just being aware of that is a really important starting point. My brain doesn't like it because change has just been announced or whatever. Say some of the things can be about just being aware of that, setting ourselves these short-term goals, those kind of things. I think, as you say, asking questions. So again, I think it's important that organisations make it as easy as possible for employees to ask those questions, encourage people to do that so we get clarity about what is known and what's not is important. And I think there's a challenge for organisations, because I think when going through change, I think there always is that dilemma from leader perspective about do I communicate a lot early, but maybe we'll have to change our minds, we'll have to do some U-turns, or do I wait until we're absolutely sure and then communicate? And there is no perfect answer, I don't think. But I think from a brain point of view, the more you can communicate, the better, or the more at least information is out there. Because as you said, if we haven't got information, we speculate, we fill the vacuum, and takes up a lot of energy. So the more we can put information out there, the more we can create a culture and organisation where people feel it's okay to ask questions, to ask the daft question, to challenge or whatever it might be. So much the better too.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point around communication. How much do we communicate? How often? I worked with different clients, and some clients really like regular communication. In fact, one of them, I remember a big retailer here in Australia asked me to exaggerate the effort to get a normal outcome. And I remember that. And because they had over 800 stores around Australia, they've got over 50,000 employees, and these people are not sitting in front of their computers. And what information you give them today will disappear tomorrow. So literally is asked that I exaggerate the effort to get a normal outcome. So anything less than exaggerated effort will give you a substandard outcome. But again, I worked with organizations, smaller organizations, and they thought sponsor well over 6 months, they can communicate 2 or 3 times. That's it. So it depends, and I agree, it depends on the environment. But I always believe that, so there's the mantra, you can't communicate enough. Some people disagree with that, thinking you're probably communicating too much. And so again, as you mentioned, the conundrum of, and this is where we come as change practitioners to really find the sweet spot and the nice balance in there.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point because I guess because now we have so many means of communication that people can feel overwhelmed, can't they? And not least in our personal lives, the amount of information that's out there now, we can feel overwhelmed. So I think it's, in some ways it's even more challenging for the change practitioner or the communication professionals in organizations to get that balance right, because there's so much out there, so much information sort of contending for our attention. So, and getting that balance right, I guess, between what information you kind of push at people and information that people is available if you want it, so you can kind of pull on that. But the importance of getting that right. And I think especially during change, is because as you talked about earlier, that the biases we have, the need also to recognize that, the way in which when we're going through change, if we're feeling anxious, we do tend to hear information differently. We've had more difficult to take information in, and two, we're more likely to hear the negatives as well. So I think the importance of being aware of that. And often I say to leaders, if you're communicating something that's surprising to people, unexpected, beware of this thing called cognitive dissonance, that if we hear something that's not quite what we were expected, a bit out of the blue, sometimes it can take the brain a while to make sense of that. So we might not be listening to what the leader says for the next 10, 15, 20 minutes or whatever it might be. So then again, the need to repeat points and allow people to go away overnight, reflect, sleep on it, come back the next day and have that chance to ask questions about what they've heard.
Hilary, what do you think? Do we sometimes create problems for ourselves by introducing weird things into the workplace? And I'll give you an example. The agile way of managing change has been the buzzword over the last few years, and the scrums and the sprints, all of those, and then the big boards in front of the staff, and then everybody's looking at this. The workplace is full of symbols. Do we sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot by focusing on our craft rather than looking at how that change is going to be perceived by the audience?
I mean, I think, no, absolutely. I think say that puts yourself in the shoes of the audience. And I think it's what you're saying about, the language of Scrum or whatever. It's and I think we've got to watch that the language isn't alienating people, that I think so often people in the know about these things, I work with lots of different organizations and there are so many acronyms for things that as an outsider, I just don't understand, and they're immediately alienating. And I'm distracted by that. What does that mean? I don't understand. Then the need to keep saying, what does that mean? Can feel awkward over time. So I think we've got to watch the kind of the terms, the language that we use. And as you say, we've absolutely, I think, as change practitioners, got to put ourselves into the shoes of the person on the receiving end, because they're the ones that have got to make the changes. And how do we help them? How do we help them through change? How do we help their brains, perhaps get over some initial resistance to that. And that's really is what our role is. And I think, working with a lot of organizations, one of the things I've observed is often organizations can have the best plans or strategies around change, but leaders can tend to go into broadcast mode about here's the change, here's the plan, here's what's good for customers, here's what's good for stakeholders, here's what's good for you. Now, please get on with it. Yes. And then wonder why a lot of employees then dig their heels in and don't want to do it. Research from the world of neuroscience and elsewhere shows that, just giving people a chance to look at information for themselves and go, I get it. I can see why option A is better than B or C, makes a big difference to our brains. And I do think that's that chance to wrap our heads around the information, see for ourselves about why that's the course of action, makes a big difference. And leaders often have that opportunity to do that amongst themselves or with the consultants they've brought in. And I think we need to spend more time with employees, giving them a chance to do that too, because that sense of, I get it, I understand it, makes a big difference to our brains and makes it much easier to go with that change rather than think it's something that's been done to me. Yeah. So there are things like that, I think, that we miss out in many organizations. Often, I think, because the speed of change, the sense from leaders, no, just want to get it through, get on with it, haven't got time to do that. But I think it's a crucial step we have to go through because, as you and I, many listeners will know, if you don't do that bit, if you don't take people with you initially, then you spend an awful lot of time afterwards kind of mopping up, coaxing people, trying to cajole people into change, and that can take a huge amount of time. So I just think that step about giving people a chance to go, I get it, is an important step.
And, Hilary, engaging people, and especially in the design stage, helps minimize the resistance as well. I often use this metaphor, which is we are like a chef. So some of us will go in the kitchen and cook the meal, then bring it out to the user. And then it's a bit of a hit and miss whether you're going to like it or not. A better approach is actually to bring the user to the kitchen, give them all the ingredients, saying, this is what we want to reach out to. And so we can work together to make it. And so that engagement in the effort is actually proven by neuroscience. It promotes a lot of dopamine. It actually increases the level of dopamine. And it minimizes any threat because I've got a take on it and I've got a stake on it. And during the change, I've often noticed that we've got two great opportunities to engage with the users. One is in the design, and the second one is in testing. And you've got two great opportunities at two junctions of the change cycle, which will give us a lot of insight, but most importantly, will allow the employees to be engaged in the process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And neuroscience, absolutely. That bit about I feel I've got a bit of control, a bit of influence over what's going on, makes a big difference to our brains.
Autonomy, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the reasons why, coaching is coming much more to the fore because, again, goals that we have chosen as opposed to goals we've been given by our manager, we process in a different part of the brain. They feel that different. And research also shows that if we've chosen a goal, then when things start to go slightly off track and wrong, if we chose that goal, we are much more committed to it. We're more resilient when things go wrong. So as you say, that bit about involving people early, and it can be just really small bits of it. It doesn't just hang a little bit of, it's just hang a little bit of control because no one wants to feel they're a complete victim of what's going on, and brains certainly don't like it. So as you say, giving people a bit of control, a bit of autonomy makes a big difference to our brains. So again, I think in any change, it's like, where can you let go? Where can you give somebody a bit of influence and control? And often, it's the people on the front line who have the interesting insights anyway. They're the ones that know what the issues and problems are. So they should be involved anyway. But also from their point of view, just feeling I've had a bit of influence here. Say it could be something quite small. Makes a big difference to us. And it reminds me of a time I was working with the technology team in one of the big investment banks. And they were saying to me, how come, people at home, they want the latest iPhone, the latest gadget, the latest this, the latest that, but try and change technology in the workplace and everybody hates it. I said, yeah, because it's partly about choice. If I choose to go and get that latest phone or whatever it might be, or laptop or whatever it might be, that's my choice. Technology in the organization is often imposed upon us. And I think it just reflects that part of that big difference of things that I have chosen as opposed to things that I feel are imposed upon me. And when things are imposed upon us, our brain's initial reaction is don't want to do it, don't like it. It's loss of control.
And when I find always that, and this is actually, it's happened to me over the last maybe 2 years, I've gone beyond the engagement. I actually sit through those engagement sessions and I gather insight about my audience. I even know about them, about how they learn, about how they process information. All of this intel will help me later manage the change for this particular group. And then usually those groups will get another change. And so I can pass on this intel to another project because it's the same group of people. Retention is usually good of staff. So those habits do not change in general. But that level of choice, autonomy, give me options, get me engaged, listen to me a little bit. And as you mentioned, this engagement should not really derail the project from the timeline. It should be embedded already within the timeline. And so therefore you don't create pressure on delivery of the project because you're engaging with people. That's actually part of the process. Now, some projects can choose not to engage employees, but then you've got the risk of later corrective action, resistance, all of those things that actually happen down the track. I want to shift gear, Hilary, and talk about the change models. So we've got quite a few change models. and we've got a Hilary Scarlett change model as well. So I've been thinking a lot about those models, and I'm thinking some of them need to be upgraded. I've actually interviewed the team from ProSci. I interviewed the team from Kota.
Right.
And both of them are actually agreeing that they've been working around the edges around upgrading some bits and pieces within their models. What's your take on that? And also, can you share with us the spaces model?
The space model. Yeah, no, and in the book I take a look at, as you know, I take a look at some of the change models around and see where neuroscience supports them or where the gaps might be. One of the change models I talk about in the book that I think does stand the test of time is William Bridges' transitions.
Yeah.
I think
Yes.
I think that's incredibly helpful. And actually, his was one of the books that, I mean, gosh, he must have written it 30 years ago or so, that I still refer to. And it's all about. It's very simple. Again, it's simply about the letting go stage, that we need to help people let go of the past. And again, I think that's often a stage that can be missed in organizational change, that they desire to get on with the future and the changes and whatever, but that pause and help people let go of the past, acknowledge that we've got to let go of that. Again, is a very important stage.
Yes.
And then he also talks about when we're in change and that uncertainty, we've been talking quite a bit about this morning, that kind of limbo period where we know things are changing, but we don't yet know what the future is going to look like. But actually, and that can be seen as a very negative time because of the uncertainty, the anxiety it creates for us. But what I like about Bridges, he says, actually, it can also be quite a creative time because we don't yet know what the future is going to look like. So this is a chance with people to say, okay, we know we've got to change, but what does that future look like? And people can kind of, can contribute to that. And then he talks about looking to the future. And I guess that's the whole bit about, behavioral change and establishing those behaviors and those kind of things. So I think in all those models, there's good stuff in there, but I think we now know more about people and the brain, and I think the world of work has moved on too. Certainly from when I started working, I think there is more. People do move around more. So people are going to be more questioning, I think, about what goes on in the organization. Yeah. There's no jobs for life anymore, those kind of things. So we have every right to be more questioning about the organization and what it's doing. So spaces, I mean, I guess is based on it's based on other people's work. It's based on research. It's based on evidence. But what it stands for is 6 factors that if we've got them, our brains are in a positive place, we can focus, we can work at our best. But if we haven't got them, our brains go into a negative place where we're distracted, we can't focus, we can't concentrate, we can't be so creative. And all 6 factors matter to everybody, but we do have different preferences, and those can change in different time and circumstances. So SPACES stands for, first off, the S stands for self-esteem. So that's about the feeling of being about being respected, about being trusted at work. It's also about feeling I'm doing well. This one will also be important to the people who are the kind of self-improvers. It's the people who love to learn. It's the people who want to master skills. Yep. So that's the self-esteem. P is for purpose, that sense that my work is meaningful and makes a difference. And again, there's lots of research out there that shows what a difference that makes to us if I know why I'm doing what I'm doing, yes. If I feel it is having a positive impact on society or other people, whatever it might be. A is for autonomy, that we've touched on already. This bit about choice. So as we've touched on, choice hugely important to the brain. Where can we give people a bit of control? Makes a big difference to us. C is for certainty, that we've also talked about quite a bit. This bit about, again, our brains craving certainty, too much so because something they can't have. But again, something we need to think about, how can we try and help people feel a bit more sure about what's going on around them. E is for equity, or a sense of fair play or transparency. And I guess that sense of, what the transparency, what the organization is doing is what it said it was going to do, that I kind of feel it's, it's fair play in that sense. And that one in particular, our need for a sense of equity, fair play, transparency has been shown to go up when the organization is going through change, that we kind of have a sense, if there's going to be change around here, then I want to know I've got as good a chance as the next person at getting the job I want or the training I want or whatever. So our need for a sense of fair play equity does go up when we're going through change. And the last one is social connection that I probably could talk about all day, but I won't. But a really important one, and one I think we have really underestimated in organizations, that I think we get it in our personal lives, that the relationships matter, social connection matters. And on the whole, when relationships are good in our personal lives, then life is pretty good. But I do think historically in organizations, we've expected employees to walk through the workplace door, either literally or virtually, and that relationships shouldn't matter to us in quite the same way because we're terribly professional. We're at work, so they shouldn't matter in quite the same way. But they absolutely do. We are deeply, deeply social creatures, and there's nothing soft about relationships or social connection. So it really, really important. Just all sorts of reasons why it matters so much to us. One, I mentioned earlier, our brains still kind of think they're out on the savannah. In a way, that's where they're better adapted to be than being here in the 21st century workplace. And if you're out on the savannah and you're part of the tribe, you're much more likely to survive and you're much more likely to make it. If the tribe throws you out, that's a threat to your survival. Yeah. So as human beings, we're constantly checking out, do I fit in? Am I part of the tribe? Am I part of the team? Does my manager care about me? Yes or no? Because it makes a big difference to us. And also partly because we are mammals, and as babies, we wouldn't make it through our first months and years of life without somebody looking out for us, looking after us. So babies will scream and cry when they're tired and hungry, but also when they're separated from their caregiver, because they absolutely know that matters in terms of survival. And again, that kind of carries on throughout our lives, that, again, our brains are checking out, is somebody interested in me? Do they care about me? If they do, I'm okay. If not, I'm not okay. So there's nothing soft about social connection. If we have it, it really helps us work. If we don't have it, it has a big impact on our ability to think, our staying power, our working memory, all sorts of things. So those are 6 factors that I think are really useful as a change planning tool, making sure it's also like a checklist of how people got these things. On some of them, we might say, no, they haven't got much certainty. Okay, well, is there something we can do more on one of the others? If maybe we can't give people more certainty right now, is there more we can do on self-esteem and learning opportunities or social connection? So I think it's a really useful planning tool. And often also I encourage managers to go and have a conversation with their team about it, about which of these 6 is the one that really matters to you. And if I give it to you, if I give you more autonomy or social connection, whatever it might be, that will help put your brain in more of a reward place where your brain can work better. So it's useful, I think, for teams to be aware of that. Are we very similar or different as a team? Or we've got different things, different preferences in terms of spaces? But also the importance of spaces, it's about a way I can work with you that activates the reward center in your brain. It isn't about throwing more money at you. It's about how I work with you that's rewarding to the brain. So particularly, the organizations I work with where money is limited, salaries are limited, it's about how I work with you. And for managers and leaders, that's obviously of a real interest about how can I work with people. If I can't give them more bonuses right now, what can I do in terms of how I work with them to make it a more rewarding place to work?
That's a really great point, Hilary. When you talked about the managers, when they make decisions become changes and changes become, actions. They need to look at your spaces model and say, have I heightened this? Am I creating heat here, or am I actually decreasing the heat? You also talked about that they look at this in regards to their employees. And so they will understand their employees, especially if they spent a lot of time with them. They understand what they value most. But there's a point that I always raise as well, which is us as employees. So for example, myself, I'm very overt about what value I appreciate. A level of autonomy is really important for me when I actually work with the clients. Now, I don't expect 100% autonomy. Otherwise, I'll be sitting in my lounge and do nothing. But I do expect a level of autonomy, because it's only through that level of autonomy it allows myself to be creative. And but is it status, or, is it fair? I mean, these are all important things. But the level of autonomy is number 1 for me. So any change that will come my way, I will measure it according to my autonomy radar rather than whether I'm going to have to be part of a group. Is that going to exclude me? All of that. These are important things, but there are more important things for me. So I think it's a two-way process in here. Yeah. We are coming to the end of the podcast, and I'm aware of your time. Fascinating conversation, and I hope to get you back in the future to really hone in on a couple of topics and through a practical discussion. It's the same question that I ask all the guests. What would be your advice to the change practice community?
I guess I would say, I think it's about understand a bit about the brain. We don't have to be neuroscientists, but I think some understanding is incredibly helpful. I think incredibly helpful for several reasons. One, I think it's really helpful for us to understand what's going on in our brains, other people's brains when we're faced with change. But also, I think where it's really helpful, I just think bringing more evidence and science to the world of change management is really helpful. I've worked in change management for many years. And, I think without this, there's always that sense from other people, oh, well, that's just your opinion. That's just, is that just the latest fad in terms of change management thinking? But neuroscience, no, it's not the latest fad. It's what we now know about the brains. Still a lot more to learn, but it's what we now know. And I think it's really useful in terms of working with leaders and managers saying, this is what we now know about the brain and what it needs to change. This is what we know gets in the way. In a sense, you can choose to ignore this if you choose it, but this is what we now know. We now know enough, say, to help people who are working in organizational change. So I think, for all sorts of reasons, it's really useful. I think bring that evidence and science into the organization is a very powerful thing to do.
Fantastic, and I appreciate that. And definitely, I will use that advice myself, Hilary. And how would listeners and people reach you?
I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. There's also a Scarlett and Gray website, Scarlett with 2 T's, that's my surname, Scarlett and Gray website. So people will find me at www.scarlettandgray.com. So I'm there as well. So LinkedIn might be the easiest.
You are also on YouTube, aren't you?
Yeah, there are some YouTube. Yes, there's some YouTube films. Yes, of me talking about. There are various films, but my publisher put a few films out when the book first came out. So those are quite useful little snippets of sort of 2-3 minute films.
Fantastic, Hilary, and I'll put the link to those in the podcast details. It's been a pleasure having you. Any thoughts around a future book, Hilary?
Well, actually, I did my lockdown project. I did write one more little book, actually. So it was, my lockdown project. It was just a very simple book called Brain Power at Work. And it's more aimed at the kind of manager who doesn't want to read a long book. It's more a dip in and dip out. So it's like, what's your challenge? Is it a difficult conversation? Is it a new person to join the team? What's your challenge? Here's a little bit of the science and here's some practical things you can do. So it's not a read cover to cover book, but it's a dip in and out book. And that came out just this year. That's available on Amazon. It's an Amazon print on demand.
Fantastic.
So
I will get a copy of that.
Great.
Hilary. Yeah. And again, we're going to put all the details about you in the podcast. It has been a pleasure having you as my guest. Really grateful for your time and your thoughts. As I said, I hope I can get you back some stage in the 2023 and we talk specifically about a couple of topics because I think there's the topic of stakeholder engagement and there's a topic that I've been promoting, which is about we do everything to create a change experience. And so so we can know all of the science and all of that, all in the aim to create that positive change experience. Because it's only through that you get better adoption, better engagement, employee engagement and all of things. But I'll leave those two topics for the future. And until next time, Hilary, stay well and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. To know more about my guests and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website and remember to subscribe. I can't wait to share with you my next episode. Until then, stay well and stay safe.